As early as 1869, Japanese immigrants arrived in large numbers to the mainland of the United States, most settling along the country's west coast. Many were laborers, farmers, and later students and political exiles who sought better economic opportunities in the United States. Japanese immigrants, along with other immigrants from Asia, quickly became targets of racial discrimination. Labor unions, journalists, and politicians alike deemed the Japanese unassimilable, drawing on pre-existing anti-Chinese sentiments and nativist yellow peril ideologies. A series of laws deprived early Japanese immigrants of the most basic civil rights, including the rights to naturalize, to immigrate, to own land, and to marry interracially. Perceived economic competition, xenophobia, and political opportunism were key factors in the targeting of Japanese immigrants, which would last well into the early 20th century.
It was a Sunday, and I can't remember if I heard it at church or my sister and I went to a neighbor's house, which was sort of across the street from church. So this was a regular Sunday, and we were all planning to go out. And then on the radio, we heard that, Pearl Harbor was attacked. We couldn't believe it.
And you hear the sirens, you can hear the bombs, you can hear all the noise of warfare. And I just couldn't believe it. Because I thought it was another radio program. And then all of a sudden I realized it was true, the war was going. And so I just stood there for a few minutes and wondered what we could do, what's going to happen.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
In the days that came after, there were so many rumors that were swirling around the community and the friends, and they would always sort of be whispering about what things are happening. And one thing that started almost immediately, was that the FBI came to all our friends' homes to investigate.
The day after Pearl Harbor, two FBI agents came to our house and told my father that please pack a small suitcase or whatever you want, because you are going to be incarcerated.
And around 6, my dad answered the door. I don't know where my sister and I were. Maybe we were in our rooms. And next thing I know, these two guys were taking my dad away. I could still see him at the top of the steps, going down with these two men, one on either side of him. They were looking for people who had fathers, who had connections with Japan. And they took them away.
One Sunday, 2 FBI agents knocked on the door. And my father answered, and the agent said, "Are you Saishi Mokushina?" My father says, "Yes." So why are you hiding from us? And he says, "I'm not hiding." He says, "My name is on the mailbox." That's how he found me. For some reason, he was not asked to be separated from my mother, which was a good thing, because she would be by herself. Because we had no family here in America. I remember going down to visit him, and he was
in jail. I visited him, you know, behind bars. And I don't remember what we talked about, except when I was leaving, he said to me, well, we may never see each other again, so take good care of yourself. Well, the sad part of that was what he told me, that I may never see him again, is he died and I never did see him again, so.
Military authorities determined that citizens and aliens alike would have to move. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved.
I don't think anyone at first thought of that we would ever be gathered up and put into camps. But little by little, it came out that yes, we were going to be put somewhere. And they started to give us shots, inoculation. I mean, I was definitely afraid of shots, and so I was very, very afraid. And sure enough, I can't remember where we got them. Maybe at church or wherever there were groups of Japanese, we started to be inoculated. So we knew something was going to happen to us. But as a kid, just so I was with my family, I guess it didn't scare me as much.
My mother was about to be boarded on a train to Heart Mountain, but she had me in her belly, and I was a few days overdue. So the doctors forbade the authorities to have my mother on the train. So I was born in Los Angeles officially. Later on, we were sent to Heart Mountain. About 18 months later, after we lived in Heart Mountain, we were transferred from Heart Mountain to Tudor Lake, and we were in Tudor Lake until the war ended.
I remember the first getting into camp. I remember it was hot and dusty. It was very, very a relief to get. I think it was a bus. I think we got off, it was a relief to get off the bus. And I remember I had to go to the washroom. There was some kind of toilet set up that a lot of the Japanese women were upset about because it wasn't completed. The facilities were sort of bare, and there was no separation of the individual stalls.
We were sent to these camps in April, so they only had 2 months to clean the stalls. And what they did was just cancel mine the water paint, and they put straw on the floor, and they hardly cleaned them. So the moment you went into one of these stalls, it was just smell of horses and manure, and they had 4 cots lived side by side, and that was our home from May, April to August.
It was a shock because when the buses went in through the gates, there were soldiers and barbed wire fences everywhere. And when they let us off the bus and we walked to our barrack, it was built under the roller coaster of the fairgrounds. And I thought, wow, that's really something. Even if none of us really wanted to be there, we'd rather have been outside of camp. I think there was a feeling of security. And it was sort of, I must say, it was fun, for us kids. We knew it was not a good place for for anyone to have to be behind bars. But they did take care of us.
I hung around with a couple of girls, and we used to just go out on the lawn and sit, and just, teenagers, just kind of sit and gab. Except this one time we were out there, and this cook came out of the kitchen. He went to the fence and he wove his finger through the fence and just hung his arm down, you know, like someone would say, stick him up from behind. And then the next minute, we heard the shot, and this cook got shot by, I think, a guard. And he was Japanese because I saw his black hair. And he just fell backwards, and it hit him in the stomach. And blood was oozing out of there. And the other two gals and I, we ran as fast as we could, yelling, they're shooting us, they're shooting us. We didn't know why he got shot. And we said, oh, we'll find out when we get inside because people will be talking about it. Not a soul was talking about it. It was just a hush-hush.
Since I was so young, I didn't feel any suffering because you're with your family most of the time, and wherever you go, you're with your family, good or bad. I'm pretty sure my parents suffered a lot because they were forced to do something that they didn't want, and also they had to let go of all their belongings. So I'm sure they really had a hard time. But I myself did not experience that hardship or suffering.
As time starts to pass, while the Japanese Americans are in the camps, increasingly it becomes more and more untenable for the US government to justify incarcerating these people for longer and longer periods of time. And so what they end up doing is starting to distribute a questionnaire to everybody who is in the camps. Many people call this the loyalty oath questionnaire. There were two questions in there, question 27 and question 28, which forced every Japanese American in the camps to identify whether or not they would serve in the US Army, whether they would forswear any allegiance or loyalty to Japan or to the emperor, etc. If you had answered yes, yes, then you were eligible to begin the search for work and to apply for leave clearance.
The way ahead. Where does it lead? A short time ago, they were in a relocation center. Now they're in the Middle West, renewing their touch with the world they left a year earlier. They're facing life in a new community with confidence, together.
So as people started to leave the camps, they go to a range of different places, during the wartime especially, like Chicago or other places in the Midwest or the East Coast, basically places that were outside of the wartime exclusion zone. Chicago becomes really attractive to people coming out of the camps because you have to think about Chicago in terms of its role in manufacturing and how much industry there was in Chicago at this period of time.
My aunt was terribly frightened of leaving the camp. She had heard horror stories about, people throwing rocks at the Japanese, and there was a lot of uprisings. And we knew we couldn't go back to California. That's what I had understood, that the Californians did not want us back there.
So my father heard through the grapevine that a place called Chicago was a place of opportunity where you can make more money and provide for a better living standard.
Chicago was probably one of the big cities that was full of opportunities of almost every kind of job.
My oldest sister left first, and she came to Chicago to work. I think you had to have a sponsor. And so she came and she got a job in accounting, and she stayed in a home where she sort of babysat and earned a little bit of spending money.
My mom moved to Chicago because she really couldn't find a good job in Detroit, but had friends here. And the friend said, come to Chicago, you find a better job. My mom was a good seamstress, so she said, come to Chicago. So that's what she did. And when I finished, I came here.
And landed up in Dearborn Station, which is not there now, but it was one of the main stations in Chicago. And then when I got on the other, I was really, all I did was just stare and wait, because here I was from a small city, and they were still these high buildings and the hustle, the muscle, and the streetcars going back and forth.
Prior to World War II, there were only about 400 Japanese Americans living in Chicago. After World War II, over 20,000 Japanese Americans end up coming through. When people first start coming here to Chicago, they're in a number of different places. There's a very large group of Japanese Americans that open up their businesses and live in sort of the Clark and Division area. There's also a pretty large settlement of Japanese Americans on the south side of Chicago, mostly centered around the Hyde Park, Kenwood area. And eventually, over time, these groups start to move further and further north.
We all sort of lived on the south side. A lot of people among the Japanese people lived on the south side of Chicago because they allowed us to rent apartments there. There was a lot of prejudice, but they were able to get apartments at that time.
Well, we lived in, I know the address. It's at 4450 South Oakenwood Avenue in Chicago. That place no longer exists, something else is there. But it was a roach-infested ghetto building. Our neighbors are mostly cockroaches.
And then about 10 minutes later, I felt sinking stations all over my chest. And then I wondered what happened. So I put the light on, and I found bugs, little bugs that were crawling on my chest. And then I took them and I pressed some of them, and I could find my good blood all over there. And that's my first encounter with bedbugs.
But when they went on their own to look for apartments, nothing was open to them because of their Japanese, ancestry. So I remember when we came out of camp, her basement apartment was just dreadful. I remember going to the bathroom and you could hear the rats in the walls, scampering. Oh my gosh, it was just horrible.
There were Sun grocery stores and Tokui stores and Hidaka's cleanings. And I was upstairs right on Clark and Division, and we had myself, we had Jiro Yamaguchi was an attorney, and then there was Tom Hira, and there was even JCL had a small office at that time.
And one thing about the south side of Chicago, it became like a little Japanese village. You walk down the street of 43rd, where I lived on, 43rd Drexel. There's a Japanese grocery store, a Japanese coffee shop, a Japanese mochi store, and you just go in that whole area. And then I would go and visit all my girlfriends and who lived on various different blocks. And it was quite an interesting time. And there was a community that got developed.
There was a Japanese store on 43rd Street called Star Market. The Star Market was, it looked big to me as a child, but it's probably maybe 1/2 or 2/3 the size of a 7-Eleven today. But that's the only place in Chicago that I knew of that a person could buy Japanese food, like sukiyaki meat and fish and rice. We were not rich, My mother was very good in saving money, and I knew that she could go to a American food store and get milk and products at a cheaper price. But my mother always said, well, we have to support each other, because if Japanese don't support each other, who will?
That's where I really got to gain a feel of being Japanese American. It's because we were always around other families, KA families.
Like so many Sansei, my parents didn't really like to talk about those war years, at least not to their kids. So my mom would talk about life before the war, but she wouldn't say much about the war, except to say kind of darkly, you think you know who your friends are, but you don't really. So
camp was it was not a taboo subject like in some families where they refused to talk about it, but they did talk about camp, and the way it wasn't in a negative tone, so it was more like just a move, like to a different town or something. But it wasn't spoken of as a real negative kind of an experience. It was just something that had to be endured.
I'm 63, and you know that even today, I can honestly say we have never discussed it in my family. I certainly would not bring it up to my mother. It would upset her far too much.
I think my parents just, they either wanted to just move on. They wanted to grow the family and not have this be a part of who they are.
I don't think we understand or realize the full impact of being pulled away from your home and where you grew up, your business, in the case of my grandfather, and in 1 week's time just be sent off somewhere. And then all the prejudice and retribution that came even afterwards, as we talked about the difficulty of getting an apartment to rent, things like that. That's many years of hardship in many ways that I can't fully understand. One, because they didn't talk about it, but secondly, it's just, unless you live it, I don't know how you'd really fully understand it.
I think with the Nisei, that's exactly what they did. They didn't want to talk about camp. Maybe some felt shame and anger and hurt, but I didn't see it. There's an expression in Japanese I learned called maya muki, which means face forward. And that's what they did. You're just going to face forward and keep going.
For several years now, we've been holding all camps reunions where we get to invite people who had experienced the incarceration process to come, socialize, and to just rekindle old friendships. It really becomes an important opportunity outside of our Day of Remembrance events, which tend to be slightly more formal, to have a more informal setting to socialize.
I thought of having an all camps reunion before people were unable to tell their story. And when people agreed to come up and answer questions, about their lives in camp or pre-war, it was very honest.
And today it's still sad for me to think about her. And every day I look out the window to see if she's gonna come home, but she never did. I'm sorry.
I believe that this year was one of the more successful stories told because, they could relate to it. That's what I want to focus on for the next All Camps reunion is more people coming to share their history and their stories.
It's been really powerful to see the really amazing actions that Jewish communities have been organizing over the past 2 weeks. And when I first saw it, I was like, oh my God, Japanese Americans have also been organizing around these detention centers and concentration camps, with sort of the exact like very similar messaging about our own history and how we're seeing it being repeated. And so I just really wanted us to have a chance to come together and kind of, think about the connections between our work.
We had these discussion groups at the dinner where we talked about, like, what does never again mean to us, and kind of what do we see happening now that resonates with our own stories and our families and our community stories. We do have this particular experience of like being incarcerated in concentration camps, and obviously like very different histories and experiences of that, but to kind of speak from that place of like there's a certain like moral authority there.
As I think about activism within the community today, there are a few sort of disparate thoughts. Your political actions should always be rooted in your history. And to me, I see that as a huge motivator. Being able to recognize that this pain and violence that was experienced by people who I loved very deeply is happening again and has happened many times. And so anytime that I see that, I think that's a huge motivator to speak up and to try to act in ways, in those same ways that I sort of condemned my grandparents for not having acted.
My name is Lisa Joy. I'm with the Japanese American Citizens League Chicago. And to start us off this morning, we're going to hear from and reflect with a survivor of an American concentration camp, Tonko Doi, and her granddaughter, S.J. Doi.
We were sent to 10 camps in remote, faraway places in the United States with climates no one else would want. I am so grateful to all of you for being here to support those who have no voice, seemingly with no rights. We are here today to say not again. We are here to give our voices to those who have no voice.
First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
No one spoke for the Japanese people when they were taken to camp. The Japanese people themselves went to camp without much pressure.
On the one hand, generations before us worked to protect us by distancing from this history. And at the same time, we're using this history to work for a better future.
There's this perception that the Japanese Americans sort of quietly went to the camps. And we actually know from our history that there were many people who stood up and opposed the incarceration process. And now, as younger generations, we take those lessons to heart and try to make linkages.
I hope that the political engagement of this community continues into the next administration and the next administration, that there are so many fights that we still have to be a part of that are also lessons that we draw from our own history, and so that there doesn't become a sense of complacency.
No, if you see something, you hear something, you read something, you say something, and you write in response.
Our participation in these marches was about us standing up as a new generation of Japanese American activists to say that our history tells us and compels us to stand up for those people who have no voice.
What would it have been like if thousands or tens of thousands of people had shown up to block the buses or tear down the flyers or whatever, even if they weren't successful, had tried to stop what was happening? And what would that have meant? It's one of those things that, you Like, even if you don't know if it's going to work, right? Like, it's really important to just like show up and do what you can.
Okay.
Ready? Go.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. 私16、3歳にいた娘。昼や3月お嫁に行きます馬小屋へ。マンさん待っててちょうだいね。That's it.
Bravo! Bravo!